For many thousands of years humans and monsters have been at war against each other. A war that lasted so long that they eventually forgot why they were at war in the first place. But over time humans and monsters settled their fight and started living together peacefully. Humans and monsters also started specializing in numerous fields such as medicine, and one of these specialists was a human doctor named Dr. Glenn Litbait, who lives in Lindworm, a city where humans and monsters lived together peacefully. On this particular morning, Glenn was seen going for another one of his morning checkups on a patient named Syria, whom he diagnosed with pregnancy. Later on, Safentit, his assistant, scolds him for treating female patients with too much care and attention. She also asked him to call her Sappy like he formerly did when they school with the medical academy together. Later that night, a message arrives at Glenn's clinic, and Glenn informs Safi that they'll be conducting a medical checkup at Lindworm Central Hospital because Dr. Fooley, their mentor, had a lot of medical cases to attend to and had delegated her duties to them. The next day, Sappy complains about syphilis, always passing down the hardest of tasks that Glenn, but Glenn smiles and tells her that it's only because she wants him to gain more experience. After they step out of the carriage, they are welcomed by a group of arena fighters, and a centaur introduces herself as Tasalia Scythio, one of the best fighters in the arena, who happens to be the princess of the centaurs, and the heiress to city transportation. After getting himself acquainted with the locals, Glenn carried out some medical checkups on the women while Sappy used her tail to grab the women who kept throwing themselves at Glenn. Princess Tasalia eventually dropped by for a checkup and asked Glenn if he would love to marry her, especially since he was the best suitor available at the moment. But Safi makes sniper marks about how Tazalia's records show that her waist size has increased in the past few months. Glenn assures Tazalia that she's in perfect condition, but after she leaves Kay and Lorna, Princess Tazalia's attendants visit Glenn to ask if the princess was suffering from any ailment. Glenn reveals that there is nothing medically wrong with her, but Kay and Lorna hesitate before telling them that their princess, who rarely ever won a match, had lost her last few matches. Later that night, Sappy rejoices about how they'll be going home the next day because they were done with their medical checkups, but Glenn tells her that he doesn't feel comfortable with going home, especially after what he heard about Princess Tazalia. He decides to stay up all night to find out if Princess Tazalia had an illness that couldn't be discovered through physical checkups, and Sati offers him some wine to keep him awake. The following day, Sappy is challenged to another battle in the arena, and she loses this round, making it her 10th loss in a row. She is greatly distressed about this as she feels like she's dragging her family's name in the mud, and she pushes herself to train harder than before. While Princess Tacelia trains in the stables, she is surprised when Glenn appears and tells her that he had found out the reason for her past losses. He reveals that it's because Tazalia's hooves had never been shot, and it was now growing in an uneven pattern, making it harder for her to balance her feet while she fought. Princess Tazalia refuses to have her hoof shot, but Kay and Lorna enter the stable and hold her in place as some blacksmiths create shoes for her, while Glenn tries to attach the shoes to her hooves. Tazalia moans dramatically and Sappy holds her in place before shutting her up by stuffing her mouth. The shoes are finally attached into sound for doing such a distasteful thing to a princess. The following week, Princess Tazalia gives Glenn and Safentit a special seat in the arena, and they watch Tazalia win her 3rd game in a row. Safi asks why Dr. Julie didn't bother to check Tazalia's hoof first, and Glenn says her that she probably knew but had only tried to test him in the first place. He also reminds her of how Dr. Cooley always respected her clients' wishes, and she wouldn't want to perform medical procedures on her patients without their permission. Later on, Sappy recalls how Glenn's family had taken her as a child hostage while they worked with her family to end the war. Glenn's family had kept her hostage just in case her family decided to betray them. However, she was released after the war came to an end. However, Glenn and Safi had grown closer in her stay with his family, and when the time came for her to leave, they were both saddened by this. Glenn's relationship with Safi sparked his interest in medicine from monsters, so he decided to become a medical doctor who specialized in the treatment of monsters. After enrolling in Nemea, a medical school which trained humans and monsters in medical treatment for monsters, Glenn was pleasantly surprised to discover that Safi had also ventured into the field of medicine. Sappy is brought out of her trance as Glenn steps in and asks if she has run out of her sunblock ointment. She realizes that her sunblock has actually finished, and Glenn suggests that they visit the Merrill waterways to get some supplies. Glenn asks Sappy to promise him that they would only get necessary supplies as they had lots of work to do later, but she gets fascinated by different objects and stops by the gift shop. On her way home, they encounter a young mermaid named Lulala Hine, and she persuades them to purchase something from her shop. Safi asks her what she's selling, and the Lala tells them that she's an excellent singer. Glenn asked Lula to sing 2 songs for the price of one, and he promises to pay her by giving her a medical examination. Lulala captivates Glenn and Sappy with her angelic voice, but she stops abruptly while singing her first song. Glenn offers to examine her in a private place, and he asks their mirror to take them somewhere quiet. The merman leads her to the canal, and after Glenn examines Lulala, he realizes that her gills have stopped working efficiently because she was almost always outside the water. He further reveals that her body had gotten accustomed to how she constantly breathed with her lungs that was starting to forget how to breathe underwater. Lulala tells Glenn that she has to stay above water to sing to passers-by and earn enough money to take care of her mother and siblings. While she explains this to Glenn, a young boy in the vicinity drowns and the Lala swims to his rescue. Sappy and Glenn ask him to steer them in that direction, but the merman tells them that he can't do this because the canal's currents were way too strong when only overturned the boat. Lulala brings the human boy to shore and Glenn tries to resuscitate him, but after he succeeds in waking the human boy, Glenn realizes that Lulala is drowning. He dives in after her. Glenn swims toward the surface while carrying her, and tries to help her with using her gills to breathe underwater. Glenn gives her some oxygen by performing mouth-to-mouth resuscitation underwater, but he swallows way too much water, and almost drowns. Sappy arrives in time, and saves them by drawing them out with her tail. Later on, Lula's gills become more accustomed to swimming underwater, and Lady Skatey offers Lula a spot at the city's singing show. Lulala thanks Glenn for his help, but Sappy gets jealous at the fact that Glenn kissed Lulala underwater. She realizes that Lulala has a crush on Glenn, but she tells him that she wants them to stay on somewhat friendly terms since she considers Lulala as a younger sister. Later on, Kumasanao, a female soldier, is seen running from some armed men. She is cornered by them, but she attacks them without hesitation. Meanwhile, Dr. Glenn is seen helping a slime to retain her physical form by immersing her in a bio-liquid, but right after she leaves, someone knocks on the clinic's front door. He is surprised to see that Mrs. Scotty, the genius behind the Lindworm, who represents Mrs. Scotty's town council, is a dragon, taken on the form of a human after descending from heaven. She had succeeded in building Lindworm, a city where humans and monsters could cohabitate peacefully in just 10 years. She was also rumored to be the central figure in Lindworm, and everyone treated her respectfully. Konazan, over bodyguard, steps forward and speaks on her behalf. She tells them that she would be speaking on behalf of Lady Scatty, and she reveals that she had been tracking some slavers when she fell into one of their traps. Kuma had faced 10 men and taken them down, but she lost her arm in the process. At the mention of this, Kumar bows her head and apologizes to Lady Scatty. She further reveals that Lady Scatty wants them to find her ham and attach it back. Button is honored that Lacey stopped by his clinic, even though she could have easily approached his mentor who owned the city's largest hospital. However, Sappy tells Lady Scatty that Glenn can't treat Kanai Zino because she's a golem and he has no experience treating them. They're all surprised when Glenn tells Lady Scatty that he would be honored to treat Kanai, but as soon as Lady Scatty leaves, Kanai tells Glenn that she would find her arm herself as she asked him not to follow her. Kanai encounters one of the slavers on her way to find her arm, and she is attacked by the slaver, who cuts off her left leg before running away. Kanai crawls away from the spot in the hopes of locating her left hand before the slaver arrives with the rest of his crew at the clinic. Sappy tells Glenn of how golems are creatures that are made from the flesh and souls of dead human bodies, and Glenn tells her that the person who had created Safi was probably a deranged doctor, as he finally understands Kume's deep-rooted hatred for doctors. After a while, Dr. Glenn tells Safi he's going out in search of Kumai Zino and her missing arm, but on getting to the market square he runs into Princess Tessalia, who informs him that she had just seen a detached leg. Princess Tessalia is stunned by how he carries it without feet, but Glenn tells her that the detached leg belongs to Kanai Zanao. Princess Tessalia reveals that she was acquainted with Kanai Zino and always admired her because she was not just the bodyguard of Lady Sketty, the central figure in the city, but also a first-ranked fighter with the highest number of consecutive wins in the arena. Glenn strokes Crime's leg and he realizes that she could feel it because Golem's genetic makeup allows them to sense all contact with their skin, with the exception of pain. Glenn goes in search of Kanai, who informs him of the rumors that he was gathering body parts for an experiment. She gives him Kun's missing arm and tells him that someone had dropped it in the canal. Lulala tells Glenn where to find Kanai and he walks off the location. Despite Khmer's protests, he joins her sutures with care before telling her that a fake doctor with me to problems was probably responsible for creating her. Meanwhile, Sappy worries about Glenn's whereabouts in Arania. Her best friend stops by and tells her that Glenn is probably busy flirting with the patient in town. Sappy feels jealous at the implication of Arania's words and she chases her off. But before she leaves, Arania gives her an egg that she had found in the streets. Glenn finishes up by joining Kume's stitches, and Kanai thanks Glenn for treating her despite how badly she had treated him, but unknown to them some slavers watch them from a dark corner and follow them back home. Glenn arrives shortly after Rania leaves and he's surprised when Sake reveals that she is pregnant. Glenn is bewildered by this cause he knows for a fact that Safi had never made it with anyone, as Sappy reveals that the egg was a gift from Arania, her best friend. Upon further inspection, Glenn realizes that it's a harpy's egg, and he tells Sake that a harpy girl had probably lost it. He also explains that harpies are oviparous and always give birth when undergoing ovulation. Sappy's serpent instincts tell her that they're under attack, and they escape just before the slavers get in. They run into Kuming, who explains that she had been tracking down the slavers who kidnap young harpy girls and forced them into ovulation before selling them to humans with illegal taste. She reveals that she was currently accompanying Lady Skady to the slavers' hideout to rescue some harpies, and she asked them to tag along. Staffy asked why civilians were being asked to infiltrate hideout, and Lady Skady reveals that they had received word that one of the female harpies was ovulating. They go to the Marrow's waterway, and Glenn is surprised that Lulala works as a mirror for Lady Skady despite her young age. He accuses Lady Skadia of taking advantage of her, but Lulala speaks up for herself and tells him that she marrows in exchange for Singh at the central hall and got a large sum of money that was more than sufficient to feed her family. On their way back to the slavers' hideout, they are attacked by some armed men, but Princess Tessalia and her attendants rescue them. Lulala takes them down the waterways before dropping them off at the slavers' hideout, but as soon as they climb down the boat, they are attacked by another slaver. Kanai attacks him and asks Safi and Glenn to enter the slavers' hideout. They arrived at the hideout and Glenn notices the teenage harpies huddled around Illy, a hard RPU he discovers to be pregnant. Glenn assists Illywood giving birth, but the slavers arrive during the operation. To everyone's surprise, Safi rises to Glenn's defense despite being asked to hide her skills in martial arts. Unfortunately, while Sappy fights against the slavers, she is hit by a poison knife and passes out due to the effects of the poison. Later on, Sappy wakes up and reveals how she had been trained in martial arts before being sent to his family as a hostage. She further reveals that she had been asked to kill his family if they went against the negotiations that were being made to stop the war. Glenn reveals that his family had known of this fact, and a servant had secretly tried to poison her on the first week of her arrival. He also reminds her of how he had stayed by her side and nursed her health, but he thanks her for this because he had learned everything he knew about medicine from there. Sappy is so shocked by how Glenn had treated her with care despite her evil intentions toward him, and she tries making a move on him, but while she does this, she is suddenly paralyzed, and Glenn explains that the poison had not entirely left her body, and one of its symptoms was paralysis. Glenn blushes as he tells her not to exert herself off too much. It also reveals that he's going for an in-house checkup on a patient, and Safi covers her face in embarrassment. Later on, Glenn's mentor Lady Cully asks him to visit the Harpy village to carry out some physical examination on the residents, and Princess Tazalia offers to give him a ride because she has a meeting with the village council elder, and Illy has asked to see her. Safi accompanies Glenn, and she tells him of how Illy had lost so many feathers that she could no longer fly. She also tells him of how Illy was an orphan with no parents or guardians to watch over her. The carriage stops abruptly and Glenn and Safi step out to see Princess Tessalia K and Lorna face flat on the floor. They explained that it's because of the rough terrain, and Glenn asks if Princess Tessalia is okay. She tells him that she feels fine, but unfortunately Kay had gotten hurt while trying to shield her. Some harpy men who were members of CK Transportation arrive on the scene and aid them in carrying Kay to the village. They arrived at the village and Lorna promises Kay that she would take care of Princess Tessalia, but unfortunately, Lorna is unable to perform her duties efficiently because she's worried about Kay. Okay, Glenn and Safi come up with a way to make Kay more efficient in her duties by disciplining her. Glenn blindfolds Lorna and asks her to focus more on Princess Tessalia and remember her duties. This helps her becoming more efficient in Princess Tessalia thanks Glenn for his help. Later on, Morna tells Kev how Glenn had helped her with performing her duties more effective, and Kay suggests that they thank him more. After a while, Kay is fully recovered and Safi suggests that they leave after she lets him see Illy. They visit Ili and Glenn checks on her, but tells him that there is nothing in his Glevin. She claims that Illy is a fake doctor because Princess Tazelia followed her before she can control her anger, as she remembers how she tried to talk to Illy She blushes and leaves Princess Tazelia for talking to the princess. Tazelia confronts Illy and asks what all the fuss is about. Ellie tells her that she wants to be an arena fighter, but Thessalia tells her that fighting is about etiquette and that someone like her, the floor girl, says she will never face Sally in a fight. If he wins, Salia accepts the challenge with the condition of being an arena fighter, and he wins the match. But when he arrives at Glenn's clinic with a scratch on his neck, Glenn asks if he's not seriously injured. But Thessaly reveals that she defeated Illy in a duel and refused to make him an arena fighter, also telling Glenn that becoming an arena fighter wouldn't help Illy because he was used to running away from his problems and being alone. Just runs again. Glenn suddenly has an idea and he asks Safi and Tazelia to help him collect Elise's feathers, and after looking at the feathers, Glenn realizes that the feathers are a different color and he uses a special melting type. Guess what he's going through? They go to look for him. They are surprised when a village scout reports Illy missing. They search for him around the village and eventually find him on the branch of a forest tree. Don't believe her. She eventually convinces him that she's going through a kind of molting that teenagers often go through before they grow their adult wings, also revealing that the reason her feathers are different colors is because she's a descendant of the phoenix. Will give. 6. Illy finally grows her adult feathers and she thanks Glenn and apologizes for insulting her. She runs off in embarrassment before showing off. The soon-to-be grown-up Illy flies past Glenn's window and complains about coming across a sticky substance in the woods that won't come off his wings, and examines it. Realizing it's half spider, half human, and a web of arachnid, she says that after a while she needs to be washed with hot water or a bath in a spring. And the other female wasps rush in with similar complaints, and Safi uses her tail to push them away from Glenn. Glenn tells her that she needs to go here, the real cause of the problem, and they visit the forest in search of arachnid. Sapi tells him to be careful of traps because arachnids are very good at setting traps, but Glenn falls into the trap. Arachnid, who is responsible for Harpy's misfortune, arrives and it turns Sapi's best friend who wants to be Iran. Frees Glenn, and his best friend talks about meeting someone who talks all the time and introduces Glenn as Iran and tells him how Iran is the most famous bettor on Lindworm. They asked him what he was doing in the Harpy village and tells them that he has heard rumors that the legendary phoenix bird, which has not been seen in decades, is now in the forest, as well as his plans to capture it and use its feathers for their next design. Glenn tells her that Phoenix is half Harpy of Illy. She lived in the Harpy village, but they asked her to promise not to do anything to him. They introduced Iran to Illy, but she got upset and chased him all over the village. Follows. When trying to get a closer look at its feathers while Arania chases Illy about, she runs into Princess Thessalia and gets some of her web on her. Princess Thessalia rushes off to Glenn to complain about this, and Glenn tells her that the strange substance on her is an arachnida's web. Sapi gets jealous of the amount of attention that Glenn is doling out to Princess Thessalia and she storms off. In anger, Glenn doesn't understand her actions, but Princess Tazelia draws his attention to the fact that Sapi was working around the clock to impress him, even though lamia such as herself were known to fare badly in the cold weather that the Harpies village was well known for. She tells him to pay more attention to Safi before walking away. Later on, Glenn gives Safi a glass of wine and thanks her for her hard work and endless commitment to work. A loud booming sound alerts everyone in the village, and the village elder sends scouts to investigate the cause of the commotion. The following day, Glenn offers Safi a drink before telling her to relax and take a warm bath in the village spring. As soon as Sapi leaves, Arania arrives and complains that she's feeling ill. Glenn carries out a physical examination, but he tells her that nothing is visibly wrong with her. However, she might be down with a cold. Glenn asks her to be more physically active and suggests that she take a warm bath in the spring, but Arania tells him that she would prefer to take a walk in the forest. Glenn expresses concern on her desire to visit the forest despite having a cold, and Arania asked him to escort her if he is so concerned. Glenn escorts her for a while, but after realizing that Arania was probably feeling much better, he asked to take his leave. Just as he turns to take a leave, he falls into Arania's trap and she gleefully reveals that she plans to strengthen her bond with Safi by making a move on him. Just when she's about to make good underwards, Princess Tazelia charges in and rescues Glenn from her grasp. She confesses her genuine love for Glenn and accuses Arania of committing a despicable deed, but Safi arrives and interrupts Princess Tazelia's speech before stealing Glenn away. She tells the two of them that she had heard their entire conversation and was tired of hearing people's declaration of love for the doctor. She also reveals that Glenn was too busy with work and not ready to get married or engaged, but she fails to notice that her tail is wrapped too tightly around Glenn that he suffocates in the process. Arania and Tazelia draw her attention to this. and she rushes him off to the clinic. After Glenn awakes, Arania apologizes for her to him, but Glenn tells her that he understands that she never truly meant to hurt him. Sappy loads up on alcohol and Glenn tries to make her feel better. He apologizes for not paying her enough attention. Sappy suddenly confesses her love for him, and she tells him that while she tries to keep her emotions in check, too many worthy opponents kept creeping up. She further reveals that while she wasn't scared of Arania, she was scared of Princess Tazelia, who seemed to have genuine feelings for him. Glenn assuages her fears by telling her that while he couldn't foresee the future, she was the only one he enjoyed sharing a glass of wine in this way. The ground trembles after Glenn's proclamations, and Safi assumes that it's because Glenn just said something cheesy, but the ground trembles again and they go out to investigate. The village elder tells them that the scouts had discovered that one of the Harpies gods, an elder goddess also known as a giant, was making her way down to the village. Princess Tazelia asked the villagers to move because they believe that they're under a curse, and the giant wants to destroy them. She asks Kay and Lorena to convey some of the Harpies who are unable to fly while the others walk down the mountain. While Glenn accompanies the villagers, he notices that Tesselia is not present and correctly assumes that she went to face the jig alone. Meanwhile, Tesselia stays back at the village and gives herself a pep talk as she prepares to face the elder goddess, but Safi arrives. And meeting Thessalia, he makes a merry speech. Sappy taunts Thessalia about choosing to fight the elder goddess despite her fear of selling the shotgun. Glenn suddenly shows up and tells her there's a better option and tells them of their plans to talk to the goddess, but Safi and Tazelia tries to hurt him. He finally convinces them to go through with their plan, and they discover that the giantess came down the mountain because she wanted to cure him of the cold. As Glenn gives her a physical and accidentally falls into her clothes stays, but he picks her up and throws her to the ground. Glenn prescribes her medicine, and the village elder suggests making sure she never catches a cold so she doesn't wander around the mountains or alert the villagers. Clothes for the female goddess, but she complains that there is no thread. People give her clothes, and Iran sews thick clothes for the big goddess. Later, Illy visits Glenn and remembers the waterway. After leaving, the queen sends an invitation to the ceremony. Tycelia reveals that Illy is now working as a messenger in the Sesha transportation system. Glenn meets with Princess Thessia, who thanks her for her willingness to sacrifice herself for the villagers, but Safi interrupts them. The move, and he is shocked by her, but her actions now prove a strong contender in the race for Glenn's heart, and he refuses to let them meet Mrs. Scatty the next day when they arrive at the Waterways memorial service. Who informs them that Iran is too crowded for mermaids, who also tells him that he is glad that everyone is happy and living better, and he walks forward to say. Glenn rushes ahead to provide medical aid, and the whole town is in an uproar. The excitement dies down in the afternoon, and Safi laments that Glenn didn't really tell them about Mrs. Scatty's health even though he visited her. When they arrive at the full office, she flirts with Glenn and wraps her tentacles around him, but Safi is jealous, stops petting Glenn after she complains that he's aged a bit since she last saw him, and Dr. Cooley insists he is still obsessed with young kids. Men Cooley told them that he believed that Mrs. Scatty had an incurable disease, and that she had suffered from it for a long time, but that she refused treatment, assuring her that she would soon wake up, as the only symptom she showed was blood was to rise pressure, and all he needs is to eat well and get plenty of rest. But his illness later goes into full swing at Glenn's clinic with a suspended Kanai, and Mrs. Fooley selfishly tells them it's time for him to die, asking Glenn to secretly check on him. The next day, Glenn and Safi arrive at the mansion, but a Kanai restricts Safi from following Glenn. The lady is horrified to see Glenn, but she realizes that the Kanai asked her to check on her and lets her pass. After giving her a physical exam, Glenn discovers that she has a tumor on her heart and examines her so delicately that he almost lets Safi groan over them, and is shocked to see the Kanai on Lady Scatty's knees, killing her. Threatens. Sappy fully supports her decisions, but to her surprise Mrs. Scatty tells them that she is fine. Sake and Glenn visit Dr. Pui's office and tell him that Mrs. Scatty can be cured. They try to convince him to help, but he initially refuses because he believes that Mrs. Skeed would never agree to a sudden injury. She would eventually agree to help them if Glenn could convince Mrs. Scuddy to operate, but she was skilled at threading them and had a lot of hands. Asked to get a person with tells them that the person doesn't have to be skilled, and Glenn suggests that they ask Aranya for help. Aranya initially refused to help because she could get in trouble if the surgery isn't successful, but she eventually agrees to help. Glenn and Safi leave Aranya to prepare for the surgery, but Glenn apologizes on their way back home cause he realizes that Aranya would cause a lot of problems in the clinic. The next day Kanai asks Lady Skedi if there's any improvement in her health, but Lady Skedi tells her that she feels the same. Kanai arrives at Glenn's clinic and allows Iranian to practice surgery on her, especially since she was impervious to pain. Later on, Glenn tells him that he's leaving for the blacksmith's workshop. He meets Meme, a shy cyclops who keeps running into trouble because she always keeps her head down and lacks self-confidence. He asks her to take him to the leader, but after meeting up with him he asked him if he could provide numerous surgery equipment within the next month. He also requests for a suture needle that was not just tiny but strong enough to cut through dragon scale. The leader delegates the task of designing the suture needle to Meme to increase her self-confidence, but she shows reluctance to do it. The leader asks her have more faith in herself and convinces her to design the suture needle. Later on, Glenn and Dr. Fooley check on the blacksmith's progress and they are shown the new equipment, but the leader apologizes that Meme is yet to provide the suture needle. Glenn tells him that he understands his decision to give such an enormous task to Meme. He also tells him how he handled his first surgery without Dr. Cooley's help, and it was also a major operation. He reveals that it helped him gain more evidence of his skills as a doctor, and Lady Fully asks Glenn if he would love to bite her tail, but he refuses and slaps it away. Meanwhile, Meme works on designing the needle. She suddenly gets an idea and turns to stare at the pounding machine. After starting at it for so long she passes out due in motion sickness, and Glenn examines her. He surmises that it's because of the heat waves and he rips up her shirt to ease her breathing. He also asks the Cyclops to assist him with carrying her. Later on, Meme wakes up in Glenn's clinic and she reveals that she had been nervous about creating this suture needles because Lady Skady had inspired her as a kid. After asking Cyclops stopped making weapons of war, she also instructed them to use their skills in creating surgical instruments. Ming tells Glenn that she so badly wanted to say Lady Scary, but she suddenly notices that her shirt has been ripped apart and she covers herself in embarrassment. Orania tells Glenn to be more careful with female clothing in the future cause clothes were everything to a woman. Orania sews a new cloth for Meme and Glenn examines her. It reveals that she had passed out because of motion sickness, which was common with Cyclops since they only had one eye. Glenn, Safi and Orania accompany Meme to the workshop and Meme reveals that she has discovered how to mass produce the suture needles and increase their strength. She succeeds in creating a tiny but strong suture needle and Glenn thanks her for her efforts and asks her to keep her head up high in the future. He tells her that it would help her in avoiding accidents in the future, but she asks if her eyebrows are weird. Glenn compliments her and tells her that it's one of the things that make her unique, but she accuses him of using his wiles on her before running off. Orania asks if she could develop a better way to deal with her shyness and Glenn tells Orania and Safety the compliments were probably too much for her, but they eye her retreating figure with envy. Later on, Lady Scatty attends a council meeting and Kanai speaks on her behalf while assisting their fears and assuring them that she's back on her feet. At the clinic, Orania complains to Glenn about how the medical records were scattered and she wonders who is responsible for this. Glenn tells Orania that he has some work to do and asks her to eat without him because he will be late after leaving Iran. He advises Safi to make a move on her, but Safi assures her that he will always come back for her as long as Glenn waits. Iran tells Sati that Glenn is a lucky lover, but offers sympathy. They go out to a ladies' night. Safi proposes to Princess Celia and Iran is surprised by her presence. After a while, Oria tells them that she believes that true love between BFS should be represented by the timing of the red thread. He returns the dragon leaf he gave Glenn when he tries to steal the dragon leaf, but he climbs out the window captured by Thessaly and Safi joins him in dragging Iran to the clinic, cruel, but says he's been acting strangely for the past few weeks. He tells Iran that he knows his attempt to seduce Glenn is just to test how strong their friendship is. Cares despite knowing her past crimes. But Sapi tells her that she knows Iran is a good person, but was only trying to maintain her bad girl image. Glenn was even more confusing because he continued to treat her with care and respect despite the fact that he had tampered with her medical records and caused a lot of problems at the clinic, falling in love with Glenn. But Aaron is surprised because he has never experienced love. The next day, Glenn visits Mrs. Scatty, who offers to pick him up and show him around town, stay in heaven, but they had come down to intervene in the war. He also said that it took 10 years to develop the city and he was proud that it was becoming a city. Monsters and monsters thrive and live in peace and harmony. Glenn tells her that she has a lot to do, and she also asks him to help her and let her watch him grow up in the city. And Glenn works with Iranian Safi and Dr. Foley, and despite many problems, the operation is a success, and Mrs. Scotty is able to speak in public without the aid of a camera, also explaining that she cannot raise her voice due to her health. Later on, Sappy falls ill in public, and when Glenn checks on him he realizes he has a sore on his tongue and rubs some honey on it. Glenn tells Sappy he needs to get checked out indoors. Glenn soon leaves for work, but he meets a scary lady and a kanai skater. Letty calls him his big brother and asks him to stay with her, but Glenn tells him that there are still house checks and manages to convince him. Chatting with his next ladies, Getty is able to leave as he notices some problems with his cart. But just then Meme walks by and misses. Scatty offers to fix it before she leaves. She tells Meme, and Glenn too gives a barrel of wine. Glenn asks Meme to guard the wine and he gets embarrassed as he shows strange looks from the villagers. Meanwhile, Arania helps Sappy get dressed, asks him to help Glenn prepare food. Roddy, but is surprised that Aran behaves like a devoted lover. He is in a harpy village where the goddess helps him lift the stones and the harpies give him food and wine, but he realizes that he has brought gifts of food, and that the council elder has too much food for the villagers, complains about being, and he asks some scouts to donate food to his friends in Lindworm. Glenn returns to Meme and he apologizes for keeping him waiting, and also reports about Princess Thessaly, and her attendants had offered to help them out with carrying the barrels of wine. Kay gives him a lift while helping her with transporting the barrel of wine. Princess Tessalia and Lorna dropped Glenn at the clinic, and Safety is surprised when he arrives with a bulk load of food and wine. He tells them that everyone he had seen on the way back had gifted him with food as Iranian lemons about the problems associated with liking a popular man. She tells Safi that she finally understands her pains and asks how she has been surviving. Meme arrives with a barrel of wine and the other Cyclops, and the Cyclops suggests that they share the wine with everyone. Glenn remarks that the food was way too much, and Sappy asks Saranya to assist her in preparing the food for the Harpies village and the entire city. After Arania and Safi have finished preparing food for everyone, the people gathered together and made merry to Salia and Safety's Arania as she complains that Glenn is way too popular, but to Sally and no Mrs. Glenn walking up to Lady Scatty, and she tells the others that it would seem that they just got another noteworthy opponent. Lady Skating cozies up to Glenn and asks him to hang out with her, but Sappy walks up to her and drags him off before telling her that she doesn't care if she's the legendary Lady Scatty. Arania and Tazelia rush over to the scene and fight over him, but Lady Skaty tells them that she'll be settling the matter by grabbing him for a minute. Safi to Celia and Arania drag him away from her, and the villagers of Ville fall on their faces laughing. But Glenn has only just begun when the entire town is enthralled by Glennon's adventures with his numerous patients and admirers.